Welcome to our presentation on poetry, Poetry Fundamentals with Maurice Thompson. So, our objectives for this presentation is to define poetry, define speaker and form, identify sound devices in poetry, identify figurative language, identify imagery and figurative language in poetry. What is poetry? Poetry is a type of literature in which words are chosen and arranged in specific ways to create an effect. Poems come in many different types, styles, and forms. Some poems tell stories, while others express emotion or paint pictures in words. The speaker. Just as a story has a narrator, a poem has a speaker, the voice that talks to the reader. Remember, the speaker and the poet are not necessarily the same person. And we'll see some examples of this later when we get into some different types of poetry. The end of a line of poetry does not always signal the end of a sentence or thought. Often, poets will continue a sentence or thought across several lines. Form. Form refers to the way a poem is laid out on the page. Paragraphs are to a story what a stanza is to a poem. Stanzas are groups of lines, which are the equivalent of sentences. The place where a line ends is called a line break. And we're going to also continue with this idea on the next slide. A line break, the end of a line of poetry does not always signal the end of a sentence or thought. Often, poets will continue a sentence or thought across several lines. Traditional versus free verse poetry. To distinguish between traditional and free verse poetry, first, a reader will notice that poems come in many forms. Some poems follow strict rules about lines and stanzas and rhythm and rhyme. These are called traditional poems. Some traditional poetry types are ballads, sonnets, and limericks. These are the ones that you're familiar with, and I think haiku, but I think haiku can also has some elements of free verse in it, but that's another conversation. All right, distinguishing between traditional and free verse poetry. Traditional or conventional poems follow the rules for lines, stanzas, rhythms, and rhyme. And we touched on ballads, sonnets, and odes before. Okay? All right. Rhyme scheme. In many traditional forms, the rhyme, beat, and structure repeat regularly throughout the poem. For instance, if this first stanza contains 5 lines, so might the other stanzas. Usually, traditional poems have a rhyme scheme or pattern that repeats across the different stanzas. So if you notice, twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are, star and are, they rhyme. Up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. So the way they designate it, you'll see that the first 2 lines rhyme. So A for the first line, A for the second line, and then B for the next line, for the third line, and B for the fourth line, because they rhyme with each other. And then because the pattern repeats, you get A again. Just an example of rhyme scheme. Free verse. While traditional poems follow rules, free verse poems break the rules. Free verse poems do not contain regular patterns of rhyme and rhythm. In free verse poems, lines and stanzas may be of varying length. The poet lets ideas dictate how a free verse poem looks on the page rather than a set number of lines or stanzas. Identifying sound devices in poetry. Sound devices are techniques used to give poetry a musical quality. Both traditional and free verse poetry often contain sound devices. Rhyme. Rhyme refers to repeating sounds at the end of words, as in night and fright. There are several kinds of rhyme. End rhymes, the rhyming of words at the end of a line. Internal rhyme, the rhyming of words within a line. And slant rhymes. Words have Slant rhyme words have similar but not identical sounds. When an end rhyme has a pattern, it is called a rhyme scheme, and we defined rhyme scheme on an earlier slide. Rhythm. Rhythm is the musical quality produced by repeating stressed and unstressed syllables. A regular pattern of rhythm is called a meter. Both free verse and traditional poetry use rhythm. However, free verse poetry does not have a meter. Onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia is the use of words whose sounds echo their meaning. Some common examples are buzz, burr, hiss, and thump. You can find onomatopoeia in many kinds of writing. It vividly describes certain sounds so readers can clearly hear them. Alliteration. Alliteration is the repetition of consonant sounds at the beginning of two or more nearby words. Alliteration can help a poet highlight keywords, make a poet more memorable, or create a certain mood or feeling. Example, a litter of playful, pretty puppies pranced in the grass. Assonance and consonance. These are two more ways of repeating sounds to achieve a specific effect. Assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds in words, such as in stone and slow. Consonance is the repetition of consonant sounds within or at the end of words, as in the phrase wide, muddy field. Identifying imagery and figurative language in poetry. Imagery is the language that helps a reader recreate in his or her mind what the writer is describing. Poets use imagery in addition to word choice, sound devices, and forms to give their poems meaning and to tap into different emotions. Poets create imagery using sensory details or words and phrases that appeal to the five senses: smell, touch, sight, hearing, and taste. Examples of sensory details are simile, metaphors, personification, and exaggeration. Simile. A simile compares two unlike things using like or as. For example, the singer purred like a kitten while singing the old love song. Metaphor. A metaphor compares two unlike things using like. A metaphor compares two unlike things without using like or as. For example, he never forgot a thing. His mind was a steel trap. Personification is giving human traits to something that is not human. The word person in personification can help you remember what this word means. For example, the ocean tossed us around without mercy. Exaggeration, some call hyperbole, is an overstatement used to emphasize a point or create humor. This flight was 1,000 hours long is an example of exaggeration, and you can see from the image where the person is exaggerating the size of the fish that they caught. These are all examples of basic elements of poetry, and we hope that you found this presentation useful. Thank you.